Hello, everybody. My name is Spoons Rattling, and welcome to the next episode of The Pleasure of Painting, where today we are painting up a Phobos librarian inspired by the classic sci-fi knights of the Jedi. We're going to start off with a slightly pale bone color. I'm using Ushabti bone. Now, normally I do this over a brighter base coat, however, I think it's just a good skill to practice painting anything over black, because it just is significantly easier than painting over white for the most part. You can see I'm doing this over all the armor panels and his rebreather, shoulder pads, anything that isn't the cloth on his armor is getting this. This will take probably a few coats, but so long as you keep the paint thin, it will actually apply very nicely. This is one of my favorite paints by GW. I think, seriously, my only problem with GW is I'm not a huge fan of the paint pots. I just wish they came in dropper bottles. But aside from that, I think they have some of the best paint in the business. So, again, as I said, you're just going to want to go around, and you really don't have to be too neat, because we're going for the sort of Qui-Gon Jinn look of the tan underrobes, I guess would be the right term, with a black robe thrown over top of it. Not black, brown, sorry. That just introduces a very earthy, warm color scheme, as we're going to see here soon. But you can see I finished applying the Ushabti bone, and it actually looked quite nice. The next step is to use those beloved speed paints from the armor painter, this one being Pallid Bone, and you're going to want to apply that over everything. Now this is not only good to use as a wash and to slightly tone down the color, it's also just going to be good practice. As I stressed in my last video, it's always important to constantly try new things with painting. A lot of things you'll pick up subconsciously, which is what we're going to practice on here in a minute. But the main thing I'm trying to work on here is my layering. What layering is when you wash something, reapplying the base color to the flat areas like this knee pad here. You're just going to want to do one or two thin coats over all the flats. This will bring that color right back up. And this was a technique that always sort of intimidated me, because when I was a younger painter, I tried it and it just never really worked out. I didn't have the brush control. But doing it now, it sort of just came naturally. I think this is to do with the fact that, like most things with a human, as you do it more, you naturally find ways to get better. So, as I've painted for, I believe, about 2 years now, I've really picked up on a lot of brush control, just subconsciously, so it would speed up my painting process. So doing this layering really isn't too hard. It's more so spotting out the flatter areas and picking them out that's the hard part, rather than actually layering it on. You can see I'm just leaving that darker brown in the recesses while leaving the brighter tan on the raised areas, as I said earlier. Now the next step is to use a nice rich brown. I'm using Rhinox hide from Citadel, one of my favorite brown paints, because it has this wonderful chocolatey, warm brownness to it, which is a weird thing to say, but hey, it is what it is. Sometimes that's what happens when you're painting, is you sort of just have to let the words flow even if they don't sound right. You're going to want to do, again, 2 thin coats of this as usual. You can see I kept it very thin, because this just allows you to build it up extremely smooth. It'll look as if that's just how this thing came, if you do thin your paints right. But if you wanted to go for another style, like, say, Luke Skywalker from the end of the Return of the Jedi, sorry, I got my names mixed up, I'd go for a off black for the armor and a very deep black for the cloth. But maybe save that for a forward deploy unit or something like that. Regardless, this isn't a whole chapter. This is more just a fun character that I've wanted to paint for a while, and I figured this was a fun way to paint him. Really, this is actually the main color you're going to be painting on this model, is this brown, as there's a lot more cloth than there is armor. It's honestly interesting for Space Marines. Usually, it's not uncommon to see tabards, which cover their stomach and hang between their legs, dangly crotch flags, as some people call them. But this guy is really just in almost full robes, as if he were a Dark Angels, or was it Guardians of the Covenant? Another one of my favorite successor chapters. They're the guys in all silver wearing red robes. All of them wear the robes. Here you can see I had to do some slight repairing with a dry brush to get some of the brown that spilled over onto the tan off, which is, again, just keep a dry brush on hand at all times. It makes any repairs significantly easier. Fixes easier. Repairs isn't necessarily the right term. From here, we're going to want to use another handy paint to have on hand, Steel Legion Drab. This is a very sandy, earthy color. It's honestly not one that I can really describe well, because when I think of drab, I usually think more towards olive, but this is very brown. Regardless, it just makes a nice counterpoint to the tan and the brown that we have. You're going to want to use this on his gloves, on his belt, on his holster, and the straps that dot around his cloak. He has 2 on his legs and 2 on his power pack, I believe. And you just want to apply this as ever, just thin down. This one I do find I need to thin a little bit more. It can come out a little thick. In fact, I think I didn't thin this enough when I did it, but it didn't come out too much brush texture or anything. And it is important to do a different step like this, as it adds in an extra splash of contrast to a relatively, I don't want to say dull model, because it's actually quite a striking color scheme. But it adds just extra visual interest and increases readability, which is the biggest thing you should work with when you're painting, is trying to make your models as readable as possible. You can see as the colors go down, each detail starts to stand out more on its own. We're also going to apply that speed paint pallid bone to the Steel Legion drab, so his belt, his gloves, and the straps around his armor. This is just to add some extra definition and bring that into the slightly warmer colors of the rest of it, as Steel Legion drab, despite being a traditionally warm color of a sort of palish brown, this is quite a cool color, I find. The next step is the metallics, using gold for his necklace, a bit on his power sword, and the Librarius logo, that's what it is, on his power pack. Then you're going to want to just use gunmetal. I'm using lead belcher, as per usual. And I'm applying this over the areas I want to be silver. What's the word? Why can't I remember? Handle for his pistol, that silver color. I painted his belt buckle silver, and of course the hilt of his power sword, soon to be effectively a lightsaber, is also this, but including that little bit of extra gold brings it back to what lightsabers usually are. They're usually silver with a bit of black and a bit of a bronzish gold color. Here you can see me applying that silver to the belt buckle, which I applied too soon. I forgot that I needed to let the speed paint dry a lot longer than the contrast paints, but it didn't really cause any issues. It just required me to go back in a few times. And don't forget the filters on his rebreather. Those are also important to pick out, and will again increase readability and make the face more interesting, which is always usually the focal point of a model. You'll find your eyes go there the most. And my advice for metallics is pretty much always the same. Don't thin them as much, because then you risk breaking the metallic flake too much. But thin it down and then just, again, apply 2, maybe 3 thin coats. It applies very well over black. It's really not too hard. And this I wasn't as worried about. We focused on silver painting in the last video, so it's not a big deal. Now we're using paint from a new brand I haven't used before, which is Pro Acryl. I'm using their Signature Series White Blue, which is a very pale, icy blue, which is fitting. If you look at lightsabers, they're usually actually a very pale color in the middle with the color stronger around the edges, which I tried to achieve with this paint, but since it's quite fluid, I barely need to thin it at all. You're going to want to apply a couple of coats and then just apply a coat, let it dry, and then do some other things. Here you can see I'm painting the flesh onto his exposed eyes and forehead. That's going to be to, again, add more differentiation since his armor's already tan. I'm also applying that tan color to the, what are those? I don't know what they're called, but the ribbed tubes around his arms. They're very common on librarians, actually. I really don't know what they are. I should look into that. But regardless, we're going to make those yellow, as they traditionally are. And so applying our yellow contrast over a tan is just the way to go. Applying it over black, it will come out very green. The next step is to make that brown more interesting, so I mixed up Rhinox hide in a flesh tone, and then I dry brushed that all over the brown on the model. This is the easiest way to highlight robes, and it just is pretty much the main step I did. I also ran Nuln Oil into the big folds in the cloak as well. You can see right there in the middle line, there's that big one between his legs. I put some Nuln Oil in there, and I ran it along a couple of the other seams. But using this dry brushing technique is the main way that I would go about highlighting and shading the cloak. Next up, we're using one of my absolute favorite paints, Imperial Fist contrast, to apply over the ribbed tubes. You can see here on his arm, I actually forgot to paint in a little bit of it with that tan color, so that part came out a little green. However, on the other arm, it was for the most part fine. And since yellow, while this applies well over light colors, it doesn't take a lot to cover it, so it was a very easy fix. Next, we're going to use Administratum Gray, which is, again, another favorite of mine for being such a boring color. We're going to use this to get the, why can't I remember it? Lanyard, that's not the right word, on his necklace, as well as picking out a couple other things, like his eyes and the, what's the word for them? Buttons, I guess, on his fancy little vest underneath his cloak. From here, we are just about done. One of the last things we're gonna do is apply this flesh wash, which is Crusader Flesh from the Army Painter Speed Paint line, which just warms that skin tone up a lot and makes it actually surprisingly stand out immensely well from the surrounding browns and tans. I did a little bit extra of this just to run it into his eye sockets, just to make sure they were nice and dark, to make any eyes I paint in later easier, which is 100% how you should do it. For your average guys, just paint in the dark and it's fine. For this guy, I painted in a little bit of whitish gray to add in that glowy eye look using the next paint we're going to use, which is actually going to be the contrast paint Pilar Glacier, which is a very interesting paint. It has very strong pigmentation where it pools and very light elsewhere. And while this sort of gets the reverse effect of a normal lightsaber, it still gets the effect down quite good. If I was a better painter, I would do some object source lighting. But again, I'm really not that good, unfortunately. Not yet, though. That's definitely something we're going to do here in the series, is try and do a bit of that object source lighting. I also used Azerman Blue on his what would traditionally be a purity seal, but I figured I'd use it as more of a tassel of cloth to, again, just add in some extra color, and it's a color that is always associated with the Jedi, as their lightsabers are predominantly blue and green. Which I thought about doing green for his lightsaber, but I figured blue would be a little bit more iconic, even though Qui-Gon uses a green lightsaber, if I'm not misremembering. Anyways, I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.